If you'd like to mark it, Steve tells me that the closing song is 502. 502. So, and then we're going to be in Acts chapter 7 this evening. If you'd like to open up to Acts chapter 7. And kind of picking up the story, chapter 6 sort of began the story. Stephen had become sort of a particular kind of worker in order to serve the widows who were not receiving the daily distribution. And then he sort of got into a thing, you could say, with the synagogue of the freedmen, and that's they come from all over kind of, but they're Jews, and arguing with Stephen about some of the things he had been preaching about. Specifically, it says in verse 13, it says, this man, chapter 6 and verse 13, it says, this man does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law, for we have heard him say that Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place, change the customs which Moses delivered to us. And so, and that is what Stephen had been preaching. I'm sure he had been preaching about the coming destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. And then he had been preaching about the transition from the Old Testament into the New Testament. And so what they were accusing him of was true, except they said he was speaking blasphemous words. Now, how do we know that Stephen's words weren't blasphemous? Or how should they have known that his words were not blasphemous?
They're scriptural.
Well, they're scriptural for one. They match the Old Testament, and he was performing miracles to prove that his message was from God. And so that should have been the end of the story. So it seems they really understood him. They just didn't like what he said. And so chapter 7 then, in verse 1, it says, the high priest said, are these things so? Now, in other words, he's giving the floor to Stephen, and he's saying, tell us about this. Now, I don't know if it's just, they're hoping that he talks himself into a corner, or maybe because of what it says in verse 15 of chapter 6, that his face looked like an angel, and maybe that just sort of struck them, and so they're like, all right, we'll listen to what you have to say. But whatever it is, Stephen begins in verse 2, and he begins what is a sermon that goes most of chapter 7. And if I were going to summarize Stephen's sermon, it'd be something kind of like this. God has guided us through many covenant changes already, but we tend to reject them. Don't make that mistake again. Right? So what kind of covenant changes had God guided them through already in the past, the Jews? Where they go from one covenant. Okay, so Moses, you have, they're in the law of the patriarchs and into the law of Moses. And remember how much trouble the Jews gave them about all of that. And so that's a good example that he will talk about here. He's saying God's done this before. This is not against God's nature to change the covenant, but we tend to mess it up. You don't have to make that mistake again. And so he starts then in verse 2, and he says, brethren and fathers, listen. And he's going to start with a good example, a positive example of when God changed a covenant and it went well. He says, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, get out of your country and from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you. And so in essence, he's saying, Abraham, you live in a particular place, you worship a particular God, you do things a certain way, and I'm asking you to just change it all. Change the place that you live, which their gods were regional, they thought of them. And so if he changes location, he has to change gods. And of course, obviously, he's asking them to worship himself, the God that speaks to him. And so in essence, he's asking Abraham to make a covenant change, to make a transition from worshiping an idol to exclusively worshiping the one true God. And so verse 4, he came out of the land of the Chaldeans, he dwelt in Haran, and from there, when his father was dead, he moved to this land in which you now dwell. And he comes to the promised land. Now God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. Even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. And so God asked him to make a covenant change, but he says there was a lot of hardship involved with it. He promises him the land, but Abraham himself doesn't actually ever own the land outright, other than a little patch that he bought to bury Sarah in. And then he says, and your descendants, the child that you will have, his descendants are going to be slaves for 400 years, or in difficult times for 400 years. And so there's a lot of hardship ahead. But verse 7, he says, and the nation to whom they will be in bondage, I will judge, said God, right? He's going to take care of all of it. And after they shall come out and serve me in this place. And he gave him the covenant, right? Here's your covenant transition, the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. In other words, what he's saying is Abraham did it. He saw that it was going to be hard, but he made that transition. And look at the results, right? Isaac begot Jacob. Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. It all went well. There were the hardships, but it all went well because when God asked Abraham to make that covenant change, Abraham didn't make that real hard. He had some bumps, but overall he said, I'll do it, God. And so here's our first kind of example of his sermon, or kind of as he introduces it, he's like, this is what it should look like. And in essence, what he's saying is, y'all could be like Abraham. Those people who were standing there that day, y'all could be like Abraham and just make this real easy on yourselves and on God. It doesn't mean there won't be hardships, but it can work out the same way as it worked out for Abraham. Now he's going to kind of get into the difficult, his second example, and he's going to give two different times that God's leader was rejected. God chooses a man to be the leader of the Jews, and they, at least momentarily, reject him twice. And so verse 9, it says, the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him, and delivered him out of all his troubles, gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now a famine and great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first, our fathers, that's the 12 sons of Jacob. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to the Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. And Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers. And they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. Right, now, do you remember in verse 9, what made them jealous of Joseph? What is it that happened that made them all envy him? His father's favoritism, I think, was very important, yes, but there was something else too. His dreams, that's right. They're all going to bow down to me, right? My father, my mother, and all of my brothers are all going to bow down to me because I will be in charge. Now, I often hear people say that Joseph was impetuous and young and he shouldn't have said all that, but you think about people in the Bible who receive dreams from God, what are they supposed to do with that information? When the boy, Samuel, heard a message from God overnight, what was he supposed to do with that? He didn't want to tell Eli. He was supposed to share it. When you receive a message from God, that makes you a messenger. And so I think he was right to tell his brothers about that dream. The fault is not with Joseph. It's the way that his brothers responded to that. And so in essence, God is communicating through Joseph. Joseph is the next chosen leader of this family. And they all said, no, he's not. Right? Here's a change. It's not a covenant change per se, but it's a change. And God's people, as they tend to, say, we don't like this change. We won't have it. And so they try to get rid of him. But of course, we know God makes it all work out. And Joseph does become the leader of Egypt, in essence, and is able to save his own family from the famine. And verse 16, it talks about how they carried them back to Shechem. It's still about the promised land. Right? Nothing has changed as far as that goes. But God promised Abraham that they would end up in Egypt, where they would be slaves for some time. And so that's, you see, all of that's working out just how God said it would. And so, but the plan is still focused on the promised land. And so Joseph was momentarily rejected. Next, he tells us that Moses was rejected, but God worked that out too. It says, verse 17, but when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt until another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. And at this time Moses was born and was pleasing to God, and was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and deeds. And so you see, God is preparing a leader. He's putting Moses in a situation where he was not only just saved from the death that the other babies endured, but that he's being prepared with skills so that he is able to lead the people. And so verse 23, it says, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit the brethren, the children of Israel, and seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. All right, so what is it that Moses had figured out in his first 40 years of life? Well, he's not an Egyptian. Yeah, he figured that out. But especially, notice what it says in verse 25. What did he want the Israelites to figure out about him that he had already figured out about himself? He's the leader. He's the one that God is preparing to lead them. But it says they did not understand. And so here we're back to the same thing. God is making a change. He's chosen Joseph to lead. They don't want, Moses to lead. They don't want God's leader. And the next day he appeared to 2 of them as they were fighting and tried to reconcile them, saying, men, you are brethren. Why do you wrong one another? And so, in essence, he recognizes that he's supposed to be the leader. And so a leader, resolves conflict between people. A leader helps people from making mistakes when their emotions are high. He's trying to kind of step in as their leader. And in verse 27, but he who did his neighbor wrong. Now, notice who specifically pushes Moses away as leader in this moment? The guilty party, the sinner. And that's kind of a theme throughout this, that it's those who prefer sin, who reject God's leaders. Now, when you think about it, he's preaching to these Jews. They want to know, why are you preaching that someone is going to destroy our town and our temple? Why are you preaching that we're going to change from the old covenant to a new covenant? And he's saying, look at our history and see, God has done this before, and sinners don't accept it. Right? People who God rejects because of their choices, those are the ones who don't accept these changes. And so he goes on and he says, verse 27, he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? And then at this saying, all right, we have Moses is still young and he's not really ready for the job yet. And so Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. And when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. And when Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight. As he drew near to observe, the voice of the Lord came to him, saying, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not look. And the Lord said to him, take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their groaning. I have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send you to Egypt. Now, in the book of Exodus, it says that the people had cried out to God. They were being oppressed. All these terrible things were happening. And so they had cried out to God. And this is God's answer. He heard their cry. He felt sympathy for their struggles. He wanted to help them. And so he goes and he chooses Moses, just as Moses had already kind of figured out. Now it's official. God has selected Moses to lead the people. But verse 35, this Moses, and right here's those 3 key words, whom they rejected. They had previously, he's talking about 40 years ago, previously said, we don't want you to be our leader. At least the sinner had said that, saying, who made you a ruler and judge? This is the one God sent to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. And he brought them out after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. And so there's a covenant change. Abraham asked to make a covenant change. He does it. It goes great. There's hardships, but it goes great. Joseph, the new leader, they don't like it and they cause lots of troubles, but God works it out in the end. Moses, the new leader, they don't like it and it causes lots of troubles, but God works all of that out in the end. Any thoughts or comments on what we've looked at so far? It's a long sermon, so I'm trying to make sure that we have enough time to get through it. But
well, all these people were just stiff-necked people you're working with. That's what it tells
right.
you throughout Deuteronomy.
Mm-hmm.
They wasn't going to get along with nobody.
Right. That's right.
and they still ain't getting along with nobody.
That's right.
All the time.
It's, for all of the time that has passed and all that the Jews have learned, in essence, they're the same people that they were the day that Moses tried to lead them and they said no, all that time. And so,
a lot of people say, Moses struck the rock and brought forth water.
Right.
And a friend of mine said, if you'd had to lead 1 million Jews, you'd have struck that rock too.
Mm-hmm.
But, because they're very difficult to lead.
It was very frustrating for Moses. And that's, he's not even really getting into all of that even, but you're right when you look at it over and over again. They tried to reject Moses and Aaron. They kept saying they wanted to go back to Egypt. They, just continuously were difficult. And
murmurers and complainers too.
That's right. And if not for really Moses's,
standing in.
Kind of standing in between and saying, please God, don't do this, Moses was, and you get a sense of Moses, whenever he decides back around verse 24 or so that he wants to take care of them, he sees one of them suffering, and so he takes it into his own hands to save him from suffering. And he sees them fighting, and he has good intentions. It seems that he wants to help the people, and you can call that a type of Christ. That's what Christ did and proved, that he really cares about people. It didn't matter how much Christ cared about people; they just didn't want to change, and that's kind of his point as he's been going through this. And so, as we pick up in verse 37, we see that there's the covenant change that Moses brought. It's rejected. So we see now he's rejected leaders. Now we're going to see the covenant change in particular. Verse 37, this is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear. Now this is a quote from Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15. And Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15, it talks about, it says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. Now he's not talking about just any prophet. There were a lot of prophets throughout the history of Israel, but it's a prophet like Moses. There's only one prophet who matched Moses in certain things. For example, Moses worked miracles that were above and beyond impressive what any other prophet in the Old Testament. Nobody parts the Red Sea. And that is just a crazy miracle. Moses does that. You don't really get impressive miracles like that until you get to Jesus. And Jesus can do some amazing things that nobody else does. But maybe even more important, Moses brings a law. He's a lawgiver. And you don't get anybody who brings a new covenant until you get to Jesus. And so that's what he says. There's going to be a prophet who is like me. He's going to be one of your brethren. And he says, him you shall hear. Now that phrase, him you shall hear, that should sound familiar. Anybody have any thoughts on where we've heard that before?
Transfiguration.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Transfiguration.
Yes, okay.
Of course,
There's a
Moses and
transfiguration.
Elijah there. Because Elijah was just about that much below Moses.
Right, yeah.
He wasn't very, just a freckle.
Yeah, he does. He raises the dead. He
things.
does impressive things, that's right. Miss Lynn, were you saying something?
I said John the Baptist.
Oh, and it's related to John the Baptist. It's at the baptism of Jesus where you also see it. That's right. And so, I'm sorry. God says it. That's right. He says it a couple of times. One of them is at the baptism of Jesus. One of them is what Steve was talking about, the transfiguration. Let's turn to Mark chapter 9. Either one of those examples will work, but let's turn to Mark chapter 9 and verse 7. And this is, as Steve was describing at the Transfiguration. Remember, Peter is there, and Jesus is transfigured, and he's talking to Moses, who kind of represents the law, and Elijah, who represents the prophet. That's kind of the summation of the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. And Peter says, well, there's three of you here. And says he doesn't know what to say. So Peter just does that. He just talks when he doesn't know what to say. And so he says, there's three of you here. Let's build 3 tents to honor you. And so really, he's putting Jesus equal with Moses and Elijah. He's doing Jesus a great honor, or so he thinks. And then the cloud comes and it interrupts him. Mid-sentence, it says, "This is my son. Hear him." No longer are we listening to Moses and Elijah. We are only listening to Jesus from this day forward. And so it's talking about that transition from the old covenant to the new covenant, which is what they had asked Stephen. Why are you talking about a transition? Removing Moses' customs from the old covenant to the new covenant. And so Stephen, in Acts chapter 6, Stephen quotes from Deuteronomy, because he's saying, Moses told us this would happen, right? They want to follow Moses. Well, he says, Moses promised us a prophet would come who, like him, would bring a new law. And God even told us at that transfiguration, this is the guy, hear him only. And so, verse 38, this is he who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles to give us, right? This is what Moses did, whom our fathers would not obey, but rejected. And in their hearts they turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make us gods to go before us. As for this Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And so this is the moment when Moses went up on the mountain to receive the 10 commandments, and it says he was there for 40 days. And in that time period, even though the people had promised that they would follow God, they get cold feet, and they ask Aaron to make them a golden calf. And so he says this is the moment where they're transitioning from the patriarchal law into the law of Moses. This is a new covenant transition, and they rejected it, just like they always do. They built this idol and said, let's just go back to how it was in Egypt. And so they made a calf in those days. They offered sacrifices to the idol. They rejoiced in the works of their own hands. And God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as is written in the book of the prophets. Yeah, Sarah, were you going to say something?
It just kind of thinking about them being like, we don't know what happened to Moses. Let's go back to what we were doing in Egypt. When Jesus was in the tomb, the apostles are like, what are we supposed to do? Let's go back to fishing. And that's really the moment when the leaders of the Jews, after the resurrection, they're like telling the guards, say the apostles came and stole his body.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it becomes this really divided leaders of the Jews against the people who are being converted in kind of a big political way, where before it was just the leaders of the Jews against Jesus himself.
Right.
Now it becomes a whole kind of polarizing idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, I think they said we don't know where Moses is. God was still hovering in the cloud and fire above them. Right? They didn't know, they couldn't see Moses, but they could still see all of that. And so, at least with Jesus, they just really thought he was dead and gone, But yeah, that it does become a thing really after Jesus is raised from the dead. And so it says, verse 42. God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven. All right, so they worshiped the sun, they worshiped the moon, they worshiped the stars, they worshiped everybody. And as it is written in the book of the prophets, did you offer me slaughtered animals and sacrifices during 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You also took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, images which you made to worship, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. And so here he's kind of raced forward, and he's still talking about the Israelites in the wilderness, but he's also just looking at their whole history and saying, isn't it just been this way all along? That you just keep on rejecting God's covenant in order to go back to or to worship something new. This section here, this is a quote from the book of Amos. This is in Amos chapter 5 and verses 25 to 27. And the question is, can I find the book of Amos? There it is. Amos chapter 5. And I think it's interesting to read it right from there, because you can notice how bad it was. He says in Amos chapter 5 and verse 25, he says, "Did you offer me sacrifices and offerings in the wilderness 40 years, O house of Israel?" Right? So talking about the days of Moses, he says, "You also carried Sikith your king, and Chian your idols, the star of your gods, which you made for yourselves." And so it really is saying all that time, there were some of those people who had idols with them all along. You don't really see that as obviously in Moses' writings. It's not as obvious, but here he says, they always had idols with them. Some of them never really accepted this covenant change. They kept these with them. And so interesting to quote for Stephen to quote from there, because that's the same trouble. The Jews, they just won't let go of the law of Moses now that they're supposed to. They just won't let it go. And so back to Acts chapter 7 and verse 44, he says, "Our fathers had the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness as he appointed." Right now, what is he talking about there? What is the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness? It's the tabernacle that they built in the wilderness, and so it was where they worshipped God. It was where God dwelt among them. Until it says, he goes on, instructing Moses to make it according to the pattern that he had seen. And that it's important that he includes that. He says it has to be made just how God said. When they made that tabernacle to a T, they made it just how God said. Verse 45, "Which our fathers, having received it in turn, also brought with Joshua into the land possessed by the Gentiles, whom God drove out before the face of our fathers until the days of David, who found favor before God and asked to find a dwelling for the God of Jacob." And so, from Moses to David, they had the tabernacle, and it moved around sometimes, but they had that house for God. But verse 74, Solomon built him a house, and so now he's got the temple. So we went from the tabernacle to the temple. However, verse 48, "The Most High does not dwell in temples made with hands. As the prophet says, 'Heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. What house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Has my hand not made all these things?'" And so, in other words, he says, when God instructed Solomon to build the temple, he said before one piece of the foundation was laid, before they'd even turned any ground over, he said, "Build me a temple, but just know it's not really sufficient." A building that people make could never really be big enough. And that's what he says. He says, "Heaven is my throne. The earth is my footstool." Even the universe is not really big enough for the one true God of his size and of his power. And so, now remember, what did they want to know from Stephen? They want to know, how can you say that God is going to destroy the temple in Jerusalem? How can you say that, Stephen? And he's saying, don't you remember? God told us from the start, the temple was never really good enough anyway. If the temple was really never big enough anyway, should it really be that big of a surprise that he had made plans always to get rid of it in place of something better someday? I mean, that shouldn't be that big of a surprise if it was not good enough from the start. And so that's really, he's kind of come to the big point of the sermon, kind of the big conclusion. He says, you want to know about the covenant change? You've always rejected the covenant change. Don't make that mistake again. You want to know about the temple being destroyed? God's always intended to destroy the temple. It's just not good enough. And so verse 51, he says, just like Steve mentioned earlier, "You stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and in ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit, as your fathers did." That's been the whole point of the sermon. As they did. They rejected and rejected and rejected. You're doing the exact same thing. Now think about it. If it didn't work out for them, what makes you think it's going to work out for you? And he calls them stiff-necked. And that's, if you go back and think about Exodus chapter 32 and verse 9. He chooses his words very carefully. Exodus chapter 32 and in verse 9. This is when the people built the golden calf, Exodus 32. When Moses was on the mountain receiving this new covenant, and he comes down and he finds that they've built it, and he says, God says to Moses, I have seen this people, and indeed, it is a stiff-necked people. So he's calling back to that very moment and saying, you are just like them. You maybe don't have a literal golden calf, but you have turned the law of Moses into a golden calf, and you are now worshiping something false, or something that's now been removed. He calls them uncircumcised in heart and in ears. And so in other words, he's saying that they listen as well as the Gentiles do. Not, obviously some of the Gentiles listen better than the Jews, but he's kind of using that as an insult because you know how Jews felt about Gentiles. And so that's, he's just saying, you're not listening. You're not really thinking about this. You're not trying. And he says, you resist the Holy Spirit. This is not about Stephen. He's saying it's not about me and about what I'm teaching. It's not about the fact that we're having an argument. You're really arguing with God. And that's when people don't want to hear God's truth. Same thing that God told Samuel whenever they wanted a king. He said, this is not about you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. When people don't want to hear God's truth, they're really arguing with God. Yes, sir.
The NASB, instead of stiff-necked, uses the word obstinate, which is
stubborn,
refusing to change.
That's right. Yeah. That's the thing about stiff-necked. It's you can't turn your neck from side to side. You can't make change. You can't turn. And so that's a good translation. Yeah. And so verse 52 then, he says, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who foretold the coming of the just one, right? Lots of Old Testament prophets said Jesus was coming. People killed lots of the Old Testament prophets. But he says, of whom you now have become the betrayers and murderers. It's not just that you're like your fathers and you kill the prophets. You killed the one. You killed the prophet, the one that Moses said would come. You killed the Messiah. And so, worse for you. Verse 53, who have received the law by the directions of angels and have not kept it. Right? They want to say, we still have to follow the law of Moses. He says, you're not even doing that. If you really cared about what Moses said, if you really follow the law of Moses, then you would have understood who Jesus is, and you would be changing from that old covenant to that new covenant right now. And so you're not even following the law of Moses, much less the right law. And by the way, he doesn't get into it specifically here, but back in verses 49 and 50, when he talks about, the temple is not good enough, he's implying, and who is or what is the new temple that they were supposed to be transitioning into? Yeah, the church, that's right. And so he's saying there's going to be a better temple, and that makes sense that you think if a physical temple is not good enough for God, if the universe is not big enough, it's going to have to be a spiritual temple. And that's all through the Old Testament. You see those clues and hints. It's not about the physical. This is always going to be about a spiritual temple. And 2 Corinthians 6:16 describes that the church is the temple of God. And so, yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. I feel like I'm dragging or something. I'm foggy. I did not read ahead. I didn't read before we came. So help me out real quick. How much time had passed between the time that Peter said the exact same thing to the Jews and this time?
It's probably been a couple 3-4 years going on here.
So when Peter was having his conversation, he was more talking to the lay people, I guess. He wasn't talking to the same audience.
That's right.
Because these are this is the high priest and the leaders of the synagogue versus.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out why there was a different outcome.
Right. Well, and that's so Peter.
Kind of the crew that
Yeah, it's a different group of people. what
had
you
passed.
had at Pentecost was mostly all the people from all around the world who had come for that particular feast.
Yeah.
Give you a list of all the different groups.
All those different
Right,
nations,
right,
yeah. So
right.
you've got, like you could call them lay people, kind of. You've got mostly out of towners for the most part. I'm sure some people from Jerusalem, but mostly a lot of out of towners, and only 3,000 or something. I'm blanking. Is it 3,000 that day? Yeah, only 3,000. I'm sure there were others who heard it. Just the 3,000, which just 3,000. Come on, we would kill them. But only the 3,000 are converted, and so yeah.
Well, and before, sorry.
No, go
before
ahead.
Stephen talks to them, people are converted. He converts.
That's
people.
right. Yes.
So this is just.
A particular, and it tells us
Okay,
in chapter
I'm sorry,
6.
I can't.
No, that's okay. Chapter 6 and verse 9, it's the synagogue of the freedmen, and in the parentheses, it's Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and those from Cilicia and Asia. And so this is not even at the temple. This is in a different part of Jerusalem, in a particular synagogue that is sort of a group of people who come from those particular locations.
Right, okay.
Clearly, they either were not at Acts 2 or they rejected it in Acts 2. And there in Acts 2, you've got 3,000 people who are on Peter's side. Here, Stephen seems alone, and it's kind of this group of Jewish people. Stephen's battling him on his own, and so no, that's a good question. Just a different circumstance altogether. Yeah. Sarah, were you going to say something?
I was just gonna say those people that were there on Pentecost are also extremely devout. That's a really expensive journey,
That's right.
and they're coming specifically for the feast.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to really be invested in God's word to go that far.
Yeah.
Where these people apparently are invested for political gain more than
Mm-hmm.
they weren't there to do Pentecost and be there for the feast. They're really there to get at Stephen because he and other Christians are taking away their followers.
Well, and that's she was talking about how at Pentecost the people came for thousands and thousands of miles. These are really devout, religious, dedicated kinds of people, versus these people who that Stephen is probably a Hellenist. He probably wasn't born in Jerusalem. He, like these people, this was probably the synagogue he was a part of before he was a Christian. This is probably the circle that he ran with originally, and he's gone back to them to try to convince them of what he has learned. And now that he can perform the miracles that can help convince them, and they're just not having it. And so that's a good question. So verse 54, and this last section of chapter 7, you see, it parallels so heavily with Jesus's own death, that just one after another similarities there. It says, when they heard these things, they were cut to the heart. Now we've heard that phrase before. Where do we know that phrase from? Acts 2 in verse 37 or 36, or they heard it, and so you can see, cut to the heart. When people really understand it, you could say in a sense they did believe it, even that this is something they felt convicted by, but they have a completely different reaction than the Acts 2:38 people. It says they gnashed at him with their teeth. That sounds very unpleasant to have. I don't understand. But he, being full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And so he is the messenger whose face was like an angel. Angels live in the presence of God. And when Moses came down from the mountain where he was in the presence of God, his face shone. Well, now here's that same messenger. He looks up and he sees the very presence of God. And so he says, look, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And so they cried out with a loud voice. They stopped their ears, right? They're like toddlers, right? I don't have to listen to you. They're just holding their hands over their ears and screaming, it says. And they ran at him with one accord, and they cast him out of the city, and they stoned him. And so Jesus was taken out of the city to be killed. Stephen is taken out of the city to be killed. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. Now that's, to lay your clothes at somebody's feet is to say that you agree with the decision that's being made, and here's the one in charge. And so Saul, who later, of course, we know becomes the Apostle Paul, Saul is clearly fine with all of this and willing to, say in a court of law, I approved of this, I approve this message. And so it says in verse 59, they stoned Stephen as he was calling on God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. We know Jesus said something very similar in Luke 23:46. He said, receive his spirit. And then he knelt down and cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. Just as Jesus said in Luke 23:34. In other words, forgive them what they do, like Jesus said. And so you see, Stephen really did care about these people. In the moment that they are killing him, after he preached a phenomenal sermon, he says, "Don't, forgive them for this. I don't want them to be held accountable for what they're doing right now." He believes that eventually they're going to put two and two together and they're going to get it. And that's, sometimes verse 51, he says, "You stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did, so do you." And it's kind of like, well, that seems uncalled for, doesn't it? Right? Like, that's pretty harsh language, but you can see Stephen is only saying that because he thinks it's going to take that harsh a language to maybe catch their attention. And he's the Holy Spirit, he's inspiring him. Stephen is speaking the truth in love, but this is, really hard hearts. Jude says, pull them out of the fire, yank them out of the fire. Really hard hearts sometimes require a little bit firmer hand in order to give them that chance. And they did not take the chance. But he really does what he can to help them.
Can you imagine the boost though of confidence of looking up and seeing
Oh, man.
Jesus?
Yeah,
I mean,
that sounds great, doesn't it? Yes, that's
and,
right.
I'm curious. This is just how my brain works, so it may be a totally pointless question, or observation. But notice that Jesus was standing on the right hand of God and
Yeah.
not sitting.
That's right.
I wonder what
There is significance there, yeah.
Yes.
So in the book of Hebrews, we're told that Jesus sat down at the right hand of God, and he's compared to all the other priests who were standing. And that's sort of the idea, they had to stand because every year they had to make that offering. Sitting is the idea of rest. And so he sat down to not make the sacrifice anymore. Standing is the idea of authority. And so is the right hand. The right hand is the idea of your right hand man, And so Jesus is presented, and that's, we're talking about a spiritual realm. Sitting or standing is used really more based off of what's emphasized than off of maybe, kind of we think, well, he's sitting and so we can't stand up. But,
I'm just
yeah.
thinking of instances where football players got hurt out on the field and everybody in the stands stood up.
Oh, yeah.
See if he was okay or what was
And that I think that there is to, he is standing with his authority to say, I agree with him. This is, what he is speaking is true. And so there's kind of a solidarity there. Like, good job, Stephen. You're doing the right thing.
But Jesus was also appalled.
I'm sorry.
I think Jesus was also appalled with this accident that happened.
Absolutely.
I mean, just touch. And he stood up. I tell you what, you just couldn't say it.
And that's to stand at this action is with his authority, and he's standing as king. It's to pass judgment. Yeah. And so, yeah. All right. Last verse 60. When he had said this, he fell asleep. All right, now, we know he died. We understand that. Why does it say he fell asleep? Okay, so there's God takes care of him. Yeah. What else?
Well,
His work was done.
His work is done, and so there's a rest aspect to it. Yeah.
he never did die. He went to heaven. And, we, as a Christian, we never really die.
Spiritually speaking.
That's right.
And I think, that's spiritually speaking. And so the Bible often uses that phrase, it fell asleep, because it reminds us he will wake back up.
It's just like Lazarus.
When Jesus comes back someday, and that resurrection day comes where our body is reunited with our spirits, it's just kind of like a long sleep. Jesus describes it that way. When that little girl dies and he says she's just sleeping, she was dead. The text makes that very clear. But Jesus sees death as just kind of like a temporary state. That's what sleep is. You do it for a short while. It's a temporary state. And so it's just kind of included there as this little positive reminder of joy. He may have died for the faith, but that's not going to last forever. Someday he'll be resurrected, like all faithful people will be.
I've always looked at that. It would take divine intervention for you to fall asleep before you get started.
I personally don't see it as literal because the Bible uses that phrase so
I
often.
just can't read into anything else other than what it says. It says he fell asleep.
Yeah,
I feel like God took care of him in that moment.
could be, yeah,
Because, you know, that'd be a pretty bad way to go.
would be, but Jesus's was too, and he endured it all, and so yeah. All right, well, we will wrap it up there for tonight. Oh, I'm sorry, one more. Yes.
Well, one more question. You said something at the very beginning that kind of struck me. And you said if you receive a message from God, it makes you a messenger.
Mm-hmm.
So as you see Stephen's giving his message,
That's right.
he gives his life.
That's right.
The whole time you've been going, I've been thinking, we have received a message.
Mm-hmm.
But the messenger, us, doesn't do our job.
Mm-hmm.
There's consequences for both sides.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. It says back from the very beginning that if Stephen received a message that made him a messenger. He received a message from God, and he gave his life. He delivered that message, and we all have received this message and accepted it, and so that makes us messengers. And there are consequences when we don't do our job. I think that's a really good point.